At 19, the Omega was forced to wed the feared Alpha King to save the pack from ruin. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Elena Hart was 19 when the future closed in around her like winter air, thin and sharp, stealing warmth with every breath. Silver Pine Pack had always lived modestly, tucked between pine ridges and cold streams, but that year the land failed them, trade routes dried up, and debts stacked higher than the snowbanks along the eastern road. Elena watched elders whisper behind cupped hands, watched hunters come back with empty packs, watched mothers ration flour by the teaspoon, and she understood something no one wanted to say out loud. Survival had become a calculation. She was an Omega, pale-skinned like the rest of her kin, quiet by habit, strong by necessity, and invisible until the moment invisibility became useful. When the council's decision reached her, it came without ceremony, carried by a bowed head and a sentence that sounded like law rather than choice. The feared Alpha King would forgive Silver Pine's arrears, secure their borders, and reopen passage through the valley. In exchange, a bride would be sent to Crimson Citadel. Elena did not ask why it had to be her. She knew. She packed what little she owned into a canvas satchel, folded a blue shawl that still smelled faintly of cedar, and stood at the edge of the common fire while the pack pretended not to look at her. The road to the Citadel stretched nearly 40 miles, and every step felt heavier than the last, not from distance, but from what waited at the end. Stories of King Rowan Blackthorn traveled faster than merchants, carried on fear and rumor, describing a ruler of iron composure and colder mercy, a man who inspired obedience with a glance and silence with his presence. Elena rehearsed her resolve as the landscape changed from familiar woods to black stone walls rising against the sky, reminding herself that courage could be quiet and still hold. The gates opened without flourish. The hall beyond smelled of polished stone and winter rain, and there he was, taller than expectation, broad-shouldered, white-skinned beneath dark attire, eyes steady as if measuring truth by weight rather than words. There were no vows spoken with warmth, only ancient phrases that bound duty to duty, a union sealed by obligation and watched by those who recorded history without comment. Elena stood straight, hands folded, heart steadying itself like a compass finding north, because fear would not save her people, but endurance might. When the ceremony ended as quickly as it began, she followed the king through corridors that echoed with restraint, understanding that love was not the promise made today, survival was. Yet as she crossed the threshold into a future she had not chosen, Elena felt something settle into place. Not hope, not relief, but a calm resolve that whispered she would remain herself within the walls of Crimson Citadel, and that sometimes the first step toward destiny looked exactly like surrender until it didn't. Morning settled over Crimson Citadel with a disciplined quiet, the kind that suggested every sound had learned when to appear and when to stay hidden, and Elena Hart woke to it, as if waking inside a held breath. The chamber assigned to her was spacious without warmth, stone floors cool beneath her bare feet, tall windows framing a sky the color of steel. She dressed herself without assistance, choosing the same blue shawl she had carried from Silver Pine, its familiar weight steadying her as she stepped into corridors that curved like thought rather than stone. Servants bowed, respectful and distant, calling her queen without curiosity, as if the word were a rule rather than a relationship. Elena learned the rhythm of the citadel quickly, measured walks that stretched nearly half a mile end to end, meals taken at precise hours, a council chamber that smelled faintly of ink and winter air. She listened more than she spoke, hearing her pack's name surface among reports and decrees, noting how trade routes reopened within a day, how riders were dispatched with seals that turned obstacles into doors. The feared Alpha King did not seek her company, and Elena did not seek his. Their paths crossed in formal spaces where voices lowered and eyes followed him, where King Rowan Blackthorn moved with an economy that suggested nothing was wasted, not even silence. When he addressed her, It was with courtesy stripped of ornament, asking after her comfort, confirming arrangements that protected Silverpine, acknowledging her presence as fact rather than flourish. She answered plainly, steady, refusing to let gratitude sound like submission, understanding that clarity could be its own strength. Days passed, measured in degrees and distance, in 40-degree mornings and afternoon walks that traced the outer walls, in letters sent north that carried news of grain shipments and repaired bridges. Elena felt the weight of choice lift from her people even as it settled upon her shoulders, and she bore it without complaint because she had decided that endurance would be her language here. At night, the citadel hummed with a contained energy, torches casting long reflections as if the walls themselves were listening. Elena stood at a window once and watched snow begin to fall, light and deliberate, thinking of Silverpine's children counting flakes on mittens, safe for another season. She did not know when Rowan joined her presence in the room, only that the air shifted slightly, warmer by a few degrees, quieter by a fraction. He did not touch her, did not crowd her space, simply stood at an angle that respected the line she drew without speaking it. He spoke first, not of duty, but of weather patterns and the way snow changed sound, how it softened footsteps and sharpened sight. Elena answered, surprised by the ordinary cadence of the exchange, by the way the conversation required nothing from her but honesty. When he left, it was with a nod that carried neither claim nor command, and Elena realized that something had changed, not in the laws that bound them, but in the air between them, thinner, more breathable. She returned to her chamber with the knowledge that survival had been secured, and that now, within the cold architecture of a marriage born of necessity, there might be space to define what dignity looked like when it was chosen every day rather than granted. The first true test of Elena Hart's place within Crimson's citadel arrived quietly, disguised as routine, when an invitation appeared beside her breakfast tray, requesting her presence at the outer council chambers before noon. The distance alone told her this was not ceremonial courtesy, nearly a third of a mile. Through vaulted halls and stone bridges suspended above inner courtyards, a walk designed to remind visitors of scale and power. Elena accepted without hesitation, choosing steady shoes and a simple gown, her blue shawl folded neatly over one arm like a promise she refused to abandon. The chamber was already full when she entered, voices tapering into silence as eyes turned toward her, not hostile, but assessing, measuring what kind of queen stood before them. King Rowan Blackthorn remained seated at the head, posture composed, gaze unreadable, yet he inclined his head just enough to acknowledge her arrival, a gesture small enough to be missed by anyone not looking for it. The council spoke of borders, tariffs, and seasonal migration, of numbers and miles and months. But beneath every word ran an undercurrent Elena recognized from Silverpine. The question of whether she belonged here or was merely a symbol traded to balance ledgers. When a senior counselor suggested rerouting resources away from the northern packs, Elena felt the room lean subtly toward Rowan, waiting for his approval. Instead, his gaze shifted to her, not as challenge, but as invitation. Elena spoke without raising her voice, choosing clarity over ornament, explaining how the northern routes functioned as connective tissue rather than expense, how stability traveled faster than coin when trust was maintained. She referenced distances in miles, harvest cycles by weeks, supply weights by pounds, grounding her words in practical detail rather than emotion. The room listened. When she finished, Rowan nodded once and rendered a decision that aligned with her reasoning, doing so without explanation, as if the logic required no defense. The meeting adjourned with formality intact, but the air had changed, less brittle, more attentive. Later that afternoon, Elena received letters bearing seals from 3 minor houses, courteous inquiries framed as congratulations, their tone revealing a shift from curiosity to calculation. She set them aside, understanding that influence often arrived wearing polite language. As evening settled, Rowan found her in the map gallery, a long hall where borders were traced in ink and history lingered like dust. He did not speak immediately, standing beside her as they studied the northern ranges, the distances she knew by memory rather than parchment. He thanked her, simply, for her insight, acknowledging her pack by name, not as obligation, but as part of the realm he intended to keep whole. Elena answered, with equal simplicity, stating that survival improved when people were seen as systems rather than sacrifices. The words surprised her as much as him, and in that moment she understood that something essential was being negotiated between them, not affection, not dominance, but respect earned through action. That night, Elena wrote to Silverpine, describing the Citadel's scale and order, assuring them that shipments were confirmed and roads secure, choosing reassurance over drama. As she sealed the letter, she realized she was no longer merely enduring her role. She was shaping it, step by measured step, discovering that within the boundaries of a forced union there existed room to redefine strength, not as fear inspired, but as stability maintained, and that realization settled within her like a quiet, unshakable resolve. Elena Hart learned that influence invited resistance when a request arrived from the Western Trade Guild, phrased as courtesy but edged with expectation, asking that she publicly endorse a revised levy that would favor river ports over upland routes. The proposal seemed tidy on parchment, yet Elena recognized the quiet harm it would do to smaller packs whose goods traveled by road rather than water, a shift that would take seasons to correct and lives to absorb. She requested time, walking the Citadel's perimeter afterward, nearly a mile of ramparts where wind pressed cold against stone and thought sharpened with each step. Rowan joined her without announcement, matching her pace, neither rushing nor leading, and asked what she saw. Elena answered with detail, naming distances, counting days lost to detours, weighing pounds of grain against hours of frost, explaining how efficiency could fracture when fairness was treated as optional. Rowan listened, eyes on the horizon, then asked whether she would speak against the guild if asked in open council. Elena did not hesitate. She said yes, not because defiance appealed to her, but because clarity demanded it. The council convened at dusk, torches reflecting off polished floors, the guild's envoys confident in tailored courtesy. When the question was put, Elena stood, aware of every eye measuring her age, her origin, her place, and she spoke with the same grounded precision she had learned to trust, outlining consequences in miles and months rather than morals, offering alternatives that preserved revenue without hollowing communities. A murmur followed, restrained yet unmistakable, and Rowan closed the matter by endorsing her plan, assigning oversight to ensure compliance. The decision landed cleanly, final, and the guild bowed acceptance without protest. Afterward, whispers followed Elena through the hallways, some curious, some cautious, all acknowledging a shift. That night, Rowan invited her to share a late meal, not a banquet, but bread, soup, and fruit, taken in a smaller chamber where formality softened into quiet. He spoke of his early years governing a realm that expected certainty and punished hesitation, of how fear simplified choices but narrowed outcomes. Elena spoke of Silverpine winters and the discipline of making do, of how survival trained patience as a skill. They did not speak of affection, nor did they need to. In the days that followed, letters arrived addressed to the Queen by name, requests framed as collaboration rather than demand. Elena responded selectively, building a rhythm of engagement that prioritized listening before decision. Rowan adjusted protocols without announcement, ensuring her presence was assumed rather than arranged, her counsel integrated rather than invited. When a minor lord attempted to bypass her authority with a flattering appeal to tradition, Rowan redirected him calmly, stating that matters affecting the realm would be considered with the Queen present. The words were measured, but their effect was immediate, and Elena felt the weight of protection settle not as shelter, but as recognition. She returned often to the ramparts, watching weather change across the valley, thinking of how power could be used to widen paths instead of narrowing them. The marriage remained a structure built of necessity, yet within it Elena discovered a partnership forming along practical lines, defined by shared responsibility and the quiet trust of decisions made together. As winter deepened and trade stabilized, she understood that the Citadel no longer felt like a holding place between past and future. It had become a space where she could stand without apology, shaping outcomes not by command, but by steadiness, and that realization warmed her more reliably than any fire. Winter pressed deeper into the valley, and with it came the season when intentions were tested not by words, but by follow-through. and Elena Hart found her days increasingly shaped by the quiet work of continuity. She began mornings reviewing dispatches that tracked shipments by the ton and schedules by the hour, noting how a delay of 12 hours at one crossing could ripple into a week of scarcity elsewhere, and she learned which questions opened cooperation and which closed it. Rowan Blackthorne observed these routines without interference, trusting patterns to reveal character, and what he saw altered his own. He invited Elena to accompany him on inspections that spanned nearly 20 miles beyond the Citadel walls, rides that traced the rebuilt roads and repaired bridges she had advocated for, and as they traveled, they spoke of governance as a craft rather than a contest. Elena asked about redundancies and safeguards, about what happened when weather ignored plans, and Rowan answered candidly, admitting where systems were strong and where they leaned too heavily on habit. At a way station warmed by a single hearth, Elena listened to stewards describe the first uninterrupted week of trade in months, the relief evident in their careful optimism, and she understood that credibility was earned when promises arrived on time. Returning to the Citadel, she received a message from Silverpine, carried by a rider who had completed the journey in under 2 days, a small miracle of logistics that spoke louder than reassurance. The letter thanked her without embellishment, reporting stocked pantries and reopened paths, children attending lessons without worry, elders sleeping through the night. Elena folded the page and held it briefly, not as victory, but as confirmation that the sacrifice had been purposeful. That evening, Rowan requested her counsel privately, presenting a plan to consolidate oversight of the northern corridors under a single office, asking whether unity would strengthen resilience or concentrate risk. Elena considered distances and seasons, recommending a shared standard with distributed authority, a balance that allowed local response without losing coherence. Rowan adopted the suggestion and named her co-signatory on the decree, a gesture that carried weight beyond ceremony. Word traveled quickly, and with it came both support and skepticism, but Elena met each with the same measured clarity, refusing to be rushed or rattled. In quieter moments, she noticed changes that were subtle yet persistent, doors opening without announcement, conversations pausing to include her rather than adjust around her, the Citadel recognizing her presence as necessary rather than novel. Rowan, for his part, grew less solitary, consulting aloud, testing assumptions, allowing silence to do its work without weaponizing it. One night, as snowfall softened the world beyond the windows, he thanked her for choosing steadiness over spectacle, acknowledging that fear had once been his most reliable tool, effective but blunt. Elena replied that fear shortened horizons, and that trust, though slower, traveled farther. They shared a moment of mutual understanding that did not require closeness to be meaningful, only alignment. As winter nights lengthened and the realm held steady, Elena realized that the marriage had shifted again, no longer merely an agreement maintained by duty, but a framework within which mutual respect generated momentum. She did not mistake this for romance, nor did she need to. What mattered was the evidence accumulating in shipments delivered, letters answered, and lives stabilized. Standing at the window before sleep, she watched lanterns trace the roads she had helped keep open, and she felt a quiet assurance settle in her chest. The knowledge that she was no longer surviving the role she had been forced into, she was inhabiting it, shaping outcomes with patience and purpose, and building a future that justified the cost. The thaw arrived earlier than expected, turning frost into water and plans into movement, and with it came a test that required Elena Hart to stand not beside authority, but within it. Reports arrived of congestion along the Eastern Pass, a bottleneck caused not by damage but by coordination, 3 jurisdictions overlapping without a shared timetable. Elena requested the ledgers and maps, spread them across the long table, and traced routes with deliberate care, calculating hours saved and miles regained by simple alignment. Rowan Blackthorne watched without interrupting, then asked whether she would lead the response. Elena accepted, understanding that leadership meant visibility as much as decision. She assembled a working group drawn from the 3 offices, set expectations clearly, and established a shared schedule measured in hours rather than promises, assigning checkpoints at 10-mile intervals and contingency plans tied to weather forecasts. Within 48 hours, movement resumed smoothly, and the pass cleared without ceremony. The success carried consequences. Invitations increased, expectations sharpened, and a faction within the council began to test boundaries by proposing symbolic appearances that offered recognition without responsibility. Elena declined politely, choosing substance over stage, and when pressed, explained that trust was built where outcomes were measured, not applauded. The answer traveled quickly, reframing her reputation from cooperative to consequential. Rowan responded by formalizing her authority over interregional coordination, issuing a decree that named roles and standards, making accountability explicit. The document bore both their seals, a visual statement that quieted speculation. Outside the council, Elena engaged the Citadel community directly, visiting workshops and storerooms, listening to practical concerns, adjusting schedules by minutes and loads by pounds to ease strain. She learned names and routes, patterns and pressures, and in doing so transformed compliance into collaboration. One evening, as the lights stretched longer across the courtyard, Rowan joined her walk, remarking that fear had once made the realm efficient at the cost of resilience. Elena replied that resilience required room to adapt, and that people adapted best when they understood the why behind the what. He considered this, then asked what she needed to continue. Elena requested data transparency and the authority to convene cross-office reviews. Rowan agreed without negotiation, recognizing that confidence followed clarity. As spring advanced, results accumulated. Transit times dropped by days, reserves stabilized, and letters from distant packs shifted in tone from caution to gratitude. Elena forwarded select messages to Rowan, not as proof, but as perspective, grounding policy in lived experience. He began referencing her assessments publicly, crediting her by name, and in doing so redefined what strength looked like within the Citadel. The marriage, once defined by necessity, now functioned as a platform for coordinated governance, not intimate, but aligned. In private moments, Rowan admitted that sharing authority had not weakened his position as feared, but strengthened it by distributing risk and insight. Elena acknowledged the risk she carried as well, understanding that visibility invited scrutiny, yet accepting it as the price of progress. On a mild evening, they stood at the overlook where roads converged, watching traffic move with purposeful calm. Elena felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but confirmation that systems could change when patience guided power. She returned to her chambers with a sense of earned steadiness, aware that the path ahead would demand more than competence. It would demand resolve when tested by doubt. Yet she was ready, grounded in results, supported by recognition, and certain that the role she once endured had become the work she chose, day by measured day. The shift became visible when a formal assembly was announced for visiting delegations, an event measured in protocol and precedence where perception carried weight equal to policy, and Elena Hart understood that presence would be interpreted as position. She prepared without ornament, choosing restraint that signaled confidence rather than deference, and entered the great hall as conversations adjusted to include her rather than pause. For her, the agenda unfolded with expected reports until a delegate from the Southern Basin presented a proposal framed as efficiency, requesting exemptions that would concentrate benefits while dispersing costs, a familiar pattern dressed in new language. Elena listened, noting omissions and assumptions, then asked precise questions about distances, storage capacity, and seasonal variance, questions that revealed the proposal's fragility without accusation. The delegate responded with practiced smoothness, appealing to tradition and urgency, and eyes turned toward Rowan Blackthorne, anticipating the decisive close. Instead, Rowan looked to Elena, not for permission, but for assessment. Elena spoke evenly, offering a counter-framework that preserved speed without sacrificing equity, outlining safeguards and review intervals measured in weeks, not years. The hall quieted, not from command, but from coherence. Rowan endorsed her recommendation and added a directive establishing her authority to oversee implementation across regions, stating it plainly, publicly, and without qualification. The effect was immediate. Titles shifted in address, posture adjusted, and Elena felt the subtle weight of legitimacy settle, not as burden, but as balance. After the assembly, reactions diverged. Some approached with genuine collaboration, others with thin smiles and careful words, testing whether proximity could soften resolve. Elena met each with consistent clarity, neither yielding nor provoking, understanding that steadiness eroded resistance more effectively than confrontation. In private, a rumor surfaced, carried by a sympathetic clerk, suggesting that Elena's influence threatened established channels and that pressure would follow. Elena thanked the clerk and adjusted nothing, trusting preparation over reaction. The pressure arrived as an invitation to a restricted council dinner, framed as reconciliation. Elena attended with Rowan, aware that symbolism mattered. The conversation circled familiar ground until a veiled suggestion questioned the appropriateness of her authority given the origins of the marriage. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Elena did not speak. Rowan did. He stated that the Queen's authority derived from results and trust, that her counsel had strengthened the realm measurably, and that questioning her place questioned his judgment. He did not raise his voice. He did not elaborate. The matter ended. On the walk back through the lamplit corridors, Elena felt the aftershock of recognition, not emotional, but structural, the kind that reorders expectations. Rowan paused at the junction where their paths usually diverged and said that alignment required courage from more than one side, acknowledging that public clarity protected both governance and partnership. Elena replied that clarity endured when it was consistent, and that she would remain so. In the days that followed, correspondence shifted again, moving from challenge to coordination, and Elena's office became a node through which solutions traveled. She wrote to Silverpine with updates that reflected stability rather than relief, noting the return of normal rhythms. At dusk, Elena stood at the overlook as traffic flowed with deliberate calm, recognizing that the marriage had crossed another threshold, not into intimacy, but into mutual defense of purpose. The realization carried weight, and with it came a quiet understanding that the next step would require not just competence, but trust declared openly, a moment when alignment would be named rather than assumed, and Elena prepared herself to meet it with the same steadiness that had carried her this far. The moment arrived not with spectacle but with necessity, when a sudden convergence of schedules threatened to unravel weeks of coordination, and Elena Hart recognized that silence would read as uncertainty. A delegation from the Northern Plateau arrived early, a full day ahead of notice, their concerns practical and urgent, seeking assurances that recent standards would hold through the coming quarter. The great hall filled quickly, not with tension, but with expectation, and Elena felt the subtle pull of attention settle where decisions were made. Rowan Blackthorne entered beside her, unannounced, and took his place without preface, allowing the room to find its own stillness. Elena addressed the delegation directly, outlining timelines and contingencies, referencing miles, days, and capacity thresholds, grounding reassurance in specifics rather than promise. Questions followed, measured but probing, testing whether authority was personal or procedural. Elena answered each with calm precision, inviting oversight rather than deflecting it, and the tone shifted from inquiry to alignment. When a senior envoy asked whether these assurances carried the full weight of the crown, Rowan stepped forward, his voice even and unhurried, stating that the Queen's word was the crown's word, and that coordination under her authority would continue without exception. The declaration was clear, public, and irrevocable, and it settled the matter more effectively than any seal. Elena felt the acknowledgement not as elevation, but as anchoring, the confirmation that trust had been named aloud. The meeting concluded with mutual understanding, and the delegation departed with schedules in hand rather than doubts. In the days that followed, Elena noticed the practical effects of clarity declared correspondence. Streamlined, approvals expedited, disputes resolved before they hardened. Rowan adjusted his own routines, deferring initial review to Elena's office, reinforcing the shift without announcement. They spoke more often, not at length, but with purpose, aligning priorities and anticipating pressures. One evening, as they reviewed transit data by lamplight, Rowan remarked that leadership often required choosing when to speak and when to stand silent, and that today had required speech. Elena agreed, noting that silence served best when structure already held. He acknowledged that the structure now did. The recognition carried a quiet warmth, not personal, but shared, the satisfaction of a system working as intended. Elena wrote to Silverpine with confidence, reporting that standards were affirmed publicly and that continuity was secured through the next season, choosing words that reflected stability rather than triumph. As spring deepened, the Citadel adapted to the new rhythm, offices coordinating seamlessly, stewards anticipating needs, and the realm responding with renewed trust. Elena walked the corridors with an ease earned rather than assumed, her presence integrated into the flow of decision. Rowan, for his part, found that partnership sharpened rather than diluted command, allowing him to focus on long horizons while Elena managed the connective tissue that made them reachable. At the overlook where roads converged, they paused together, watching movement unfold with measured calm. Elena understood then that the marriage had crossed its most critical threshold, from alignment inferred to alignment declared, a turning that transformed perception into practice. The knowledge settled with clarity, and with it came readiness for what followed, the understanding that destiny was not a moment seized but a course maintained, and that together they had chosen to name it, publicly and with purpose. Spring completed its turn into early summer, and with it came the moment Elena Hart recognized not as arrival, but as continuity affirmed. The Citadel moved with a confidence born of habit rather than urgency, schedules holding, corridors alive with purposeful calm, and Elena found herself less occupied with correction and more with cultivation. She convened a review that spanned the past quarter, inviting representatives from each region to speak plainly about what worked and what strained, setting the tone with openness that encouraged candor. Rowan Blackthorne attended without ceremony, listening as voices described smoother passage, predictable timelines, and the relief of knowing whom to call when conditions changed. When the review closed, Elena summarized outcomes. In measured terms, noting gains in days saved, reserves stabilized, and confidence restored, framing success as collective rather than personal. Rowan addressed the assembly briefly, affirming the standards and naming Elena's office as the enduring center of coordination, stating that stability was now the realm's expectation, not its exception. The declaration carried a quiet finality that settled into practice. Later, away from formal halls, Elena walked the inner garden where new growth edged stone paths, reflecting on how the marriage that began as an exchange had become a partnership defined by trust exercised in public and maintained in private. Rowan joined her there, not as ruler addressing queen, but his counterpart acknowledging shared ground. He spoke of future horizons, of infrastructure measured in years and resilience measured in generations, asking how she envisioned sustaining momentum without exhausting those who carried it. Elena answered with patience learned from seasons, advocating rotation, transparency, and rest built into systems, explaining that endurance required room to breathe. Rowan accepted the counsel readily, recognizing that foresight extended beyond control into care. As evening settled, they stood at the overlook one last time before the season turned fully, watching caravans trace the routes that had once faltered and now flowed with steady purpose. Elena thought of Silverpine, of letters that now spoke of ordinary concerns rather than survival, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction that did not need witness. The marriage remained what it had always been in form, yet its meaning had evolved into something chosen, renewed daily through aligned action. Rowan acknowledged this with a simple statement, that he trusted her judgment as he trusted his own, and that the realm was stronger for it. Elena received the words without flourish, understanding that trust declared once must be practiced continually. As night gathered, lanterns lit the roads below, and the Citadel settled into a rhythm that no longer depended on fear to hold. Elena returned to her chambers aware that destiny, when stripped of myth, often looked like work done well and relationships tended with care. She prepared for the days ahead with the same steadiness that had carried her from obligation to purpose, confident that what they had built would endure because it was grounded in clarity, shared responsibility, and respect earned through time. In that knowledge, she rested, not because the work was finished, but because it had found its shape, and because the future, once a narrow passage, had opened into a road wide enough to walk together.